I will introduce our first speaker. So Daniela Almansi is a translator from Venice, Italy, an avid student of nonsense. Her PhD thesis was on translating nonsense and nonsensing translation. I really appreciate turning the noun nonsense into a verb there. That's great. She's translated a great deal of poetry, including The Hunting of the Snark, but also from Edward Lear and Korney, Chukovsky. And she's going to be speaking to us today about translation, about Italian Carrolliana, and about the rule of sound over sense in the art of translation. So Daniela, please take it away and welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to USC and to the US Carroll Society of North America for inviting me to speak about La Caccia allo Squarlo, which is my translation of The Hunting of the Snark. It's the first time I present it to a non-Italian audience. Usually when I present my translation, I speak to Italian speakers, and so I read the poem aloud. But in this case, as I assume that many of you don't necessarily speak Italian, I'm going to talk about slightly different aspects. The material book, its layout, illustration, how it came to be published, how I came to translate the poem, some of the problems I encountered, how the poem fits in the landscape of other Italian translations, not only of the Snark, but also of the Jabberwocky. So I will also read just a few lines from my translation, but don't panic. I assume that most of you know the original, and as Carroll would say, just take care of the sound and let the sense take care of itself. So here's the book. I hope you can all see my PowerPoint. I will show it also in its true form. As you can see, it's quite large. Its title is La Caccia allo Squarlo, un'agonia in 8 spasimi. It was published by Orecchio Acerbo in 2021. It's the latest Italian translation of the Snark, but there have been about 9 or 10 others as far as I know. The first difference of this particular Snark compared to the previous Italian ones has to do more with the publisher than with myself. Previous Italian editions of the Snark tend to be targeted at an adult audience. Here are a few examples. The format is quite small. The layout is quite sober. They do have the illustrations, but it's the layout remains quite sober. The original is usually in parallel with the translation. They're often extensively annotated, and they have very, very long translator's notes, often making up to 70% of the book. Orecchio Acerbo, on the other hand, is a children's publisher. And they have a completely different attention to the visual dimension of the book. So the format is larger, it's extensively illustrated, not by one, but by 2 artists, Peter Newell, that you can see on the cover, the 1903 illustrations by Peter Newell, and also by a contemporary Italian artist called Cinzia Gigliano, who made the illustrations especially for this book. So let me show you. Here is an image from Fitz the First, and so you can see Peter Newell illustration on the right, which is already describes a scene which is already from the middle of the Fit. Is the baker joking with hyenas. On the left, there's the illustration by Cinzia Gigliano, which it's a small image that gives a sense of what the Fit is going to be about, and she does that for every Fit, except I think for the 4th and the 6th. You can also see that in the layout that the script is in different colors, and the idea is really to help to give a visual help to a reader who is not necessarily used to reading such a long poem. So it's really a book that's made also with a younger audience in mind. However, it also contains the original, which is at the end of the book. And there are two very, very short notes, one by myself and one by the publisher. These notes are more personal than scholarly. Actually, they're more about our own personal take on the Snark. And so there's something a little bit for everyone. There's, it can be read by a younger audience, but also by an older one who might be interested in the original or in other details about the poem. Let me read just the first stanza so you have a sense of what it sounds like. È un posto da squarli, gridò il capitano, sbarcando tra I flutti ribelli, un uomo alla volta con solida mano reggendolo per I capelli. È un posto da squarli, con questa fan due, ciò basti a levarvi il pensiero. È un posto da squarli, con questa fan tre, se son tre vuole dire che è vero. La ciurma includeva un cerastivali, un cuci cappelli e cappucci e un contabile esperto di beghe legali in caso di liti e di inciucci. Poi c'era un bravissimo contabiliardi che chiese per essere a bordo un piccolo acconto di 6 miliardi e un cassiere per dare l'accordo. There you go. And so Cinzia Gigliano, beside these small introductory illustrations, also makes larger ones. This is also from Fit the First. You can see part of the crew. You have the bellman on the left. On the right, you have the beaver, the banker and the baker, the maker of bonnets and hoods on the back. And the Hitler-like figure on the front is actually the butcher. And in this case, Cinzia Gigliano really makes a different choice compared to Peter Newell and Henry Holiday, who depicted as a child. This is partly her own idea about the butcher. Of course, it might also be due to the fact that I translated the butcher in the sense of killer, executioner, carnefice, and not in the sense of the profession. And this because the profession would be macellaio and it didn't have the right initial. My crew all begins with a C. So, and in other cases, for instance, in the case of the baker, Cinzia Gigliano remains quite close to Peter Newell. You see Peter Newell on the right, Cinzia Gigliano on the left. So it's really a kind of visual duet between the two, where sometimes she follows Cinzia Gigliano follows Newell's suggestions, and sometimes she does her own thing. Now, let me tell you a little bit about how I came to translate the Snark. So back in 2019, I was invited to give a talk about nonsense in a cultural center called the Chukovsky. And I was supposed to be talking about monsters and traveling. So of course, I had to talk about the Snark. And I wanted to quote some passages in Italian from the Snark, and the translations I knew didn't quite work with what I wanted to say. Most of them don't follow this game of having all the names of the crew having the same initials. They didn't really work with one aspect that I find very important in Lewis Carroll, which is the role of sound over sense, meaning that the sound kind of orients and decides what the plot is going to be about, which in the Snark can be seen in the names of the crew, which will begin with the same letter, and also in the rhyme and meter, which is very structured. And I think that this is extremely important in the Snark, because on the one hand, you have this very elusive content, and on the other, you have this very, very structured form. And I think the dialogue between the two is really essential to the Snark, but also to Carroll in general and to nonsense literature in general. So I started translating a few passages, and one thing leading to the other, I ended up translating everything. And then I decided to propose it to Orecchio Acerbo, because I was already working with them on another nonsense poem, Crocodil by Chukovsky. And also I knew that they had published several things by Carroll, which I wanted to show you. This is an edition, a very lovely edition of the Jabberwocky with illustrations by Raphael Urwiller. And also this edition of Alice in Wonderland. Oh, I should mention the Jabberwocky with a translation by Masolino D'Amico, who translated Alice, the Alice books, and also The Hunting of the Snark. And this is Alice in Wonderland, with illustrated by Yaoi Kusama and translated by Millie Graffi, who also translated the Alice books and The Hunting of the Snark. And I think the main reason why Orecchio Acerbo accepted was that they are really in love with Peter Newell, the 1903 illustrator of the Snark, and they had published his slanted book, which some of you may know, which in Italian was translated as Libro Sbilenco. So as I told you before, there have been several Italian translations of the Snark before me, about 9, so far less than the Alice books, but still quite a reasonable number. The two on the left are quite classical translations of the Snark. The first is La Caccia allo Squarlo by Roberto Sanesi, who makes the choice of adding an additional line to each stanza. So it's each stanza has 5 verses. Sanesi says it's because Italian is far more verbose than English, and he's not wrong. So it's difficult to fit all the contents in the stanza, and he's right. La Caccia allo Squarlo, translated by Millie Graffi, is the most scholarly one, I would say. It's very extensively annotated, and it has lots of notes and information about other translations and the illustrations. And the La Caccia allo Squarlo is a more recent, is probably my favorite, beside my own, of course. And it's also the closer to, in terms of the choices, Loris Pellegrini makes. So I had to be very careful not to read it too much while I was translating, because I always felt like imitating him. So one of the most interesting things to follow, I think, when you look at other Italian translation is how they translated the name of the Snark. And there have been several choices. Some of them decided to make a calque or to keep Snark, like Cesare Vico Ludovici, Roberto Sanesi, Lucio Mazzi, Barbara Turitto. The others tend to play with the name, the word squalo, which means shark. In Italian, you probably all know that the Snark is a portmanteau word of the word shark and snake or snail. And so you have squarco, you have slualo, you have squallo, you have squillo. And it's not always clear what they are portmanteau of, but you know it starts from the squalo. And my choice as well is squarlo is a play on the word squarlo, is a play on the word squalo. The publisher, in the publisher's note at the end of the book, says that it's portmanteau between squallo and tarlo. Tarlo means woodwork, but also means obsession. And in fact, I used tarlo at a certain point to talk about the butcher having only one idea, this idea being Snark. In Italian, it's aveva un sol tarlo, ma il tarlo era squarlo. But actually, it could also be a play between squalo and urlo, which is scream, or squalo and squarcio, which is a kind of laceration. Actually, the main reason is that I found that squarlo was quite easy to rhyme, and the word snark rhymes about 11 times in the poem, and some of the solutions of the previous translators were very difficult to rhyme, whereas squarlo worked quite well. the other issue, of course, was the name of the crew. It's very, very difficult to translate the names of the crew, because they have to fit the story, but they also have to begin with all with the same initials. None of the Italian translation I know do it, on except for Luca Tomasi. And at the beginning, I was quite discouraged. I also looked at French translations, and they don't do it either. And then my main inspiration was actually the Russian translation by Grigory Grushkov, Охота Snarka, who manages to do it, and he does it brilliantly. And so it made me understand that maybe it was possible to do it. So I tried to make it. I had to make a few tweaks, of course. So the beaver remains a beaver. Castoro is a beaver. Bellman becomes capitano, which is captain. The baker becomes a cook. The banker is a cashier. I already talked about the butcher. The boots is a boot shiner. The maker of bonnets and hoods is more or less the same thing, even though I invented the word. The billiard marker becomes a billiard counter, and the bujum becomes a cujo because it had to begin with a C. The big sacrifice I had to make was that I had to merge the barrister and the broker into one character, because they really, really, really didn't fit in the metrics. And I felt quite bad about it, because I mean, it's Carroll. You don't eliminate a character just like that, even though I did. But I thought that the issues of metrics and of sound and of rhyme were more important, and so in a way it was a lesser evil. Besides, I was quite comforted to find out that Mike Batt, in his West End adaptation of the Snark, added another character, the bishop, if I'm not mistaken. And so I thought that since the broker actually doesn't appear very often in the poem, he's mentioned only twice, maybe I could do it. And of course, this had a few consequences on the illustrations. So this is one case. This is from the 58th, so it's the last fit. And it's the only case where we had to make a slight change to Peter Newell's illustration, where the words coming out of the baker being captured by the Snark are, of course, boo in English, and we changed it to ku, because my bujum is a kujo. And this was also a big problem, because even though the broker is mentioned only twice, Peter Newell illustrated in the Fit the Force, he draws the broker, and so I had to slightly change the text, not mentioning the two characters, but just saying there are people who are doing this activity over there. Of course, the biggest challenge was for the illustrator Cinzia Giuliano, who had to deal with an Italian text which was missing one character, and with Newell's text, which of course is Newell's illustrations that are referring to the original. And so her solution, here is another example, is that when she tries never to show the whole crew together, and when they're all gathered together, she tries to make them a bit crowded and adding other elements, so that it's not very easy to distinguish who is who, and it's not the main point. And I think it quite works with the poem, because it's clear that some of the characters stand out, like the baker, the bellman, the beaver, the butcher, and other are kind of decorative, like the maker of bonnets and hoods, or the broker. So, excuse me. The last point I wanted to make the choices I've made as a translator regards the nonsense words in the poem. So as many of you know, the nonsense words in The Hunting of the Snark come from the Jabberwocky. And the Jabberwocky, being part of the Alice books, has been translated many times into Italian. I already mentioned the one by Masolino D'Amico and the one by Milligraffi. There is a third, among many others, there is a third quite well-known translation, which was actually by my father, Guido Almansi, who made it for this publication of the Alice books. It's a publication from 1978, and it's also a kind of a hybrid publication with interesting choice in terms both of translation and illustrations. The Wonderland book is illustrated with the original drawings by Lewis Carroll for On the Ground, and the Looking Glass book is illustrated with Carroll's photographs. And there are many translators involved in the project. So there's an old translation by Ranieri Carano for Wonderland, the translation by Giuliana Pozzo, even older, for Looking Glass. The recently, but at the time discovered Wasp episode was translated by Camillo Pennati. And then they asked my father, Guido Almansi, to retranslate all the puns and poems in both books, including the Jabberwocky, which in his version is called the Lanciavicchio. And I will now read you the beginning of the Lanciavicchio. Era la brilla e I fanghilosi tavi ghiravano e ghimblavano nel biava. Mensi e procervi erano i borogavi e il momico rattio superiava. Alma dell'alma, fuggi il lanciavicchio e la zannante zanna e l'arpionante arpione, fuggi il giubbio picchio e il frumido banderiscone. And the words I highlighted in red are actually some of the words that reappear in The Hunting of the Snark. And so I chose, and this is what I actually talk about in my translator's note in the book. I chose to use the same nonsense words. First, of course, it was a kind of a tribute to my father, who also passed away exactly 20 years before the book was published. But also, I thought it was nice to think that these nonsense words translated into Italian were already waiting for the Snark in Italy. They were like the gateway for my own Snark to enter into the Italian landscape and to make it feel welcome in a way. So they had this double function. And this is it. I thank you very much for listening, and if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Hi, folks. Any questions for Daniela? Daniela, I was curious about, you mentioned the translation earlier that was your favorite, that you purposely did not read as much because you didn't want to emulate. So yes. Now that yours is done, how is yours different or similar to your favorite?
We use the same metrics. We use the same metrics. We use the same rhyme scheme. So we both try really to stick to the sound of the original. Of course, we made the different specific choices. It's difficult to describe it in the abstract because without quoting from the poems, but I think I added a few. I had different solutions in certain cases. I added some wordplay that Loris Pellegrini doesn't do. For instance, there was this fantastic opportunity with the beaver who is always making lace on the bow of the boat. And at a certain point, the barrister tells him that making lace is kind of illegal. And in Italian, I had this great opportunity due to the fact that the word lace, pizzo, is also, it's the money you pay to the mafia so that the mafia protects your business. So I could use pizzo in both senses. I was able to add an additional wordplay that was not in the original, which is something that Loris Pellegrini, for instance, doesn't do. And also, like in terms of the material book, Loris Pellegrini also, although he claims that he doesn't want to be too scholarly, but he also has a very, very extensive translator's note where he explains every single choice he makes. And I think it's a big temptation for any translator to explain why they did everything. But in my case, also because of what the publisher wanted to do, I didn't do that. I didn't explain too much.
Could I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
Sure.
Okay. Cultural references are sometimes a problem in translation. For instance, your old Father William references a poem that was well known to British people.
Mm-hmm.
Did you run into any cultural references that would not make sense to Italians, and thus you found something parallel in the Italian landscape?
Yes, yes. Thank you very much for the question. I'm on mute.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I'm still here. Can you hear me?
Daniela, you're muted again.
Can you hear me now?
There you go.
Okay.
I hear you.
Yes. So thank you very much for the question. It's a very good question. I'm thinking in Fit the Second, when the bellman begins his speech, he begins with French romance and countrymen, which is a quote from Shakespeare. And that it really didn't make much sense to use an Italian translation of Shakespeare, because I don't think Italians would recognize it. And so I actually moved it to Dante. I will read it. I will just read you this part. Just the two stanza where the bellman begins to speak. Decise pertanto di fare un discorso. Decise pertanto di fare ricorso a dosi abbondanti di vino, e mentre la spiaggia iniziava un discorso, vedeste com'era bellino. Così fu l'esordio, in mezzo al cammin, un verso alla ciurma ben noto, e tutti a gridare ben detto cin cin, rabboccando il boccale già vuoto. So nel mezzo al cammin is not an exact quote, but it clearly to an Italian audience, it very clearly refers to nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita, which is the beginning of the Divina Commedia, the Divine Comedy.
We have a couple questions in the chat. What Chukovsky did you translate, Daniela?
It's the poem called the Crocodil, so Crocodile. It's his first children's poem, which actually inaugurated Soviet children's literature, and which was very, like, it really changed a little bit the landscape of Russian children's literature, introducing some nonsense into it. And Chukovsky himself was a translator of English poetry, and he was heavily influenced by Lewis Carroll, by the way. So it's also a long poem in three parts. Very, very nice, much more childish than The Hunting of the Snark, but I also had great fun translating it.
Another chat question. What are the rules you applied for line length, syllable count, and beats?
Sorry, I didn't understand the question.
What are the rules you applied for line length and syllable count?
Ah, okay. So I
And
was
beats?
not particularly strict, but but I use Anapest loosely, but mostly I read it aloud to myself, giving myself like the beat pa pa pam 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 pa pa pam. I know it doesn't sound very professional, but this is the way I was working. I really wanted it to sound well when it was being read aloud. I wasn't being too technical about it.
And can you elaborate a little bit on, you mentioned that sort of the nonsense words were kind of a functioned as kind of a gateway for your Snark to kind of enter the world. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yes. So what I meant to say is that so these nonsense words already exist in Italian because the Jabberwocky has been translated so many times. Of course, my father's version is not necessarily the best known one. Probably the best known one is the one by Milli Graffi, the Charlestrone, which is also used in films, and also, of course, there's the Italian version of the Disney cartoon that uses some of these nonsense words in the Song of the Cheshire Cat. But still, I mean, my father's version is also quite well known in Italy, and so these words are already there. They were like a way of preparing the field for the Snark to arrive in Italy. That's what I meant to say. I hope I made myself clear. Maybe not.
Yes, absolutely. There were also some questions about the best way for folks to get a hold of the book to purchase.
I think it's available on Amazon, or you can order it from the publisher, Orecchio Acerbo. Maybe I should write it in the. I will write the name of the publisher, Orecchio Acerbo Editore. So if you look up their website, you should be able to purchase it.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Any further questions for Daniela? We do have another question in the chat. At what point do nonsense words become meaningful as they enter the culture? Excuse me, as they enter the culture through poetry?
Do nonsense words ever become meaningful? I'm not. It depends what you mean by meaningful. If you mean that they end up having a semantic meaning, I don't think. I think they can be adopted and loved and used in every which way everyone wants to. And I think poetry and music are certainly the best way of making them beloved by the audience. But meaningful in the sense that they end up meaning something specific, I hope not. Especially, I hope not that the Snark will never end up meaning something specific. It would be a shame.
Right. Thank you very much. So I believe that, so thank you very much, Daniela. That's really fascinating. I hope folks can get a hold of the book. Some of the illustrations you showed at the beginning were also really fascinating too, by the way. I love that.
Thank you very much.
The very first one of the Snark that you showed was really terrific.